Hello everybody, this is Michelle Fox and welcome back to The Simple Quilter. Today's topic is piecing quilt backs. Now I want to talk to you about 4 major reasons why you would piece the quilt back. Number 1, it is a major stash buster. A twin size quilt takes 5 to 6 yards for the back. A queen, double, or king takes anywhere from 7 to 9 yards. So you can do some real stash busting by piecing those quilt backs. Now the second reason is that it saves you money because you're using what you already have. Now previously I have been accustomed to buying a 108-inch fabric for the back so that it's all one solid piece. And I'm not going to lie to you, I do still do that at times, but I have been piecing more backs for my quilt simply because I do like the look. The third reason is to create more interest in your quilt and give it a reversible effect, because sometimes the back can just be as bright as the front. Now, it doesn't mean that your back has to be as detailed or as intricate or as time-consuming as the front, but you can add fabric to add splashes of color in a more simple pattern to draw interest to the back of the quilt. And then also, if you use leftover coordinating fabrics from a line of fabric, it helps to tie the front or the back into the front of the quilt. And it doesn't have to be fabrics that coordinate specifically with that line, but just coordinate with the fabric you've selected. Okay, now before I show you in full the back of the quilt behind me, I wanted to give you just a few tips when piecing the backs. Number 1, you want to remove the selvages. That's the pieces at the ends of each side of the fabric. You want to be sure that you remove those. These are woven a little bit tighter and differently than this part of the fabric, so you do want to be sure to remove those selvages. And some people use 1/4 of an inch and some people use 1/4 of an inch. People who use 1/2 of an inch say that it gives your quilt a little bit more durability. I don't really know if that's true or not. I've done it both ways. I really like to use 1/4 of an inch and press to one side. I'm not fond of pressing my seams open. If you do choose to press your seams open, be sure you decrease that stitch length so that you have smaller stitches to just help give it a little bit more durability. Now, another thing that helps me is to just do a quick drawing of the design that I want on the back. This just helps me to get a good idea of just what I want, and I do a little bit of math to see, like in this quilt, I'll show you a little bit later, I added a strip down the middle, so I wanted equal sizes of fabric on both sides, so I do the math on that, but just drawing a simple diagram really helps me. The next tip I want to give you is I typically keep the backs simple. I don't make them as complicated as the front of the quilt. I just keep it nice and simple, but that's just another tip. So in this quilt, I've just sewn horizontal strips together. You could sew them vertically. You could do a combination. Those are all simple designs to use for your quilts, and this is a vertical or a horizontal one. I'll show you an example of how I piece the strips vertically in another quilt I'm going to show you. I also think it's a good idea to stagger the seams so that all of your seams aren't right on the fold line. Right here I did piece them all right down the middle. And I don't think that's going to cause any problems, but just keep in mind your fold lines are there, and if possible, staggering those seams might add some durability to your quilt and quilt back. You can also use leftover blocks in the back of your quilt. I've seen that. I've never done that. I hope to do that in the future, but I've never done that. And then one thing I'm going to start doing is I'm going to start trying to sew my labels into the back of my quilt instead of just sewing them onto the back. I want them to be embedded within the back of the quilt. And I think that spare blocks or extra blocks will just enhance those labels. Okay, so now I want to show you the back of this quilt. And this is the back of the spool quilt that I just showed you. This is a very simple pattern that I selected. Again, it's just horizontal strips of fabric sewn together. But I think the back is just as bright and cheery as the front. So let me step aside and show you this from top to bottom. Another note about this pieced back, this has some coordinating fabrics that went with the fabric line of the panel that I used on the front, and also some came from my stash, so you can mix them up. The idea is just to use fabrics that will coordinate, look good, and ones that you can use from your stash. Alright, now this is a quilt I've also shown you before. This is a panel quilt. It's another one of my favorites. But this is a great example of using vertical strips of fabric on the back. And again, the fabric on this, the fabric on the back of this is all fabric that coordinates with the front and was specifically fabric left over from this line that coordinated with this panel. Okay, so this is the back of the quilt, and this is just a great example of using vertical strips of fabric to make a pieced back. I love the outcome of this, and I really do think that it creates a reversible effect like I mentioned before, and it does help tie the back into the front of the quilt because I have used all coordinating fabrics. Okay, so this next quilt is the baby quilt that I showed you when I was making half square triangles, but I am getting ready to piece the back for this. I wanted to use the coordinating fabrics that I had picked out for this fabric line. This is actually the second quilt that I've made out of these fabrics that I selected, and I was just trying to use as much as I could on the back. So I'm going to step aside so you can see this quilt, and then I'm going to show you how I started putting the back together. Okay, so before I get started with showing you how I am going to be piecing the back, I wanted to tell you that this quilt measures 43 by 46 inches. And when I get finished, my quilt back will be about 50 by 50. When you're going to take your quilt to have it machine quilted by a long arm quilter, you really need to have 4 inches of overage on every side. But because I'm going to be quilting it by my domestic machine, I'm just going to be leaving at least 3 inches on each side. Now again, I removed all the selvages from the fabric, and when I was making the quilt top, I cut a lot of pieces in 4 by 10 or 4 by 10.5 inch strips because that's what the triangle paper I was using called for. So I had a lot of strips that were 4 inches wide. So I decided to just sew those all together and put this right down the middle of the back of the quilt. Okay, so that was the beginning of my design. Then I had several pieces of fabric that went from selvage to selvage, so I cut those in half. And I added 9.5 inches here to just give me enough additional fabric so that I would have enough overage for this. So these pieces I just started adding. So as you can see, that's going to make a great design for the back of the quilt. So the back will be tied into the front of the quilt. The quilt will be reversible, and I've used the fabrics in my stash and I didn't have to purchase any additional fabrics. Now I do want to show you, this box when I started was completely full. And this is all that I have left. And I had enough pieces, I had a large enough piece of this that I could cut the strips for the binding. So these few little pieces will be added to my scrap bins. And again, I didn't have to purchase a thing. I hope this video has inspired you to try piecing the backs of your quilts. I hope that you've enjoyed this video. Please give me a thumbs up if you like the video. Share with a friend if you haven't already. Subscribe if you haven't already. And as always, leave a comment. I try to respond to each and every comment. And until next time, have fun quilting.